All right, diving in today, we've got Bernard Williams, a philosopher, really shook things up in ethics back in the late 20th century.
Mm.
And I think for folks like us, really digging into philosophy, we probably spent a lot of time with those big systematic moral theories, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Kant, utilitarianism, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
But Williams, he wasn't buying it, not one bit.
Hmm.
He thought our ethical lives, they're just way too messy, way too human to fit neatly into those kinds of systems.
Yeah, that's spot on. He really saw this whole project of trying to create a moral theory that would basically be like a, a decision procedure. You just plug in the variables and boom, out pops the right answer. He saw that as just fundamentally misguided.
Totally. And there are two ideas that kind of drive his whole approach. First one is the importance of what he calls subjective integrity,
Hmm.
staying true to your own deepest values and commitments. He was really worried about how these big moral theories could actually alienate us from our own motivations, almost make us strangers to ourselves. And then the second big thing is his philosophical naturalism. So this idea that philosophy needs to be grounded in the real world, in human experience and history, not in some abstract, metaphysical realm. He was after a philosophy that was, in his words, thoroughly truthful and honestly helpful. Pretty good call.
Yeah, totally. And you see those two strands, the integrity piece and the naturalism piece, kind of woven together throughout all his work. So the focus on integrity is really this challenge to the impersonality of a lot of modern ethics. And then the naturalism is this insistence that, hey, ethical inquiry, that has to start with our lived experience, not from some detached realm of values.
Right. Okay, so in this deep dive, we're going to kind of take you through Williams's journey, his philosophical journey. Start with a little bio. Who is this guy, right? And then we'll dig into his big critique of how moral philosophy was being done in his time. Then get into his idea of what he calls the morality system, his arguments against utilitarianism, and then wrap up with his thoughts on internal and external reasons. So it's going to be a whirlwind tour, but I think it'll really give you a sense of how Williams was challenging the very way we think about ethics.
Totally. And what's really cool, I think, is how even though he's doing all this criticism, all this dismantling of these traditional ethical frameworks, he's actually pointing towards something. He's got a vision for a richer, even though it might be more complex, understanding of what it means to be a moral agent, what it means to live a good life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's start with that biographical sketch.
Yeah.
Bernard Williams, born in Essex, 1929, had a super rigorous academic upbringing. Chigwell School first, and then on to Balliol College at Oxford. There he read Greats, which, for anyone who's not familiar, that's this incredibly demanding program that covers everything from ancient Greek philosophy to contemporary stuff. And it's interesting, there's this contrast, right, between the kind of ethics he was reading in the Greeks, very rooted in history, culture, character.
Right.
And then you have the more abstract approach of his tutor, Richard Hare.
Yeah.
And it seems like that contrast, those two different ways of doing ethics, really had a big impact on him early on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in Greats, you're reading all these thinkers, their ethics is so intertwined with their history, their culture, the specific characters they're dealing with. And then, fast forward to the 20th century, you've got this turn toward this universalizing, very formalistic approach in moral philosophy. It's like, okay, what are the abstract rules that apply to everyone, regardless of context? And you can see how someone steeped in the Greeks might look at that and be a little skeptical.
Yeah, for sure. And he wasn't just an ivory tower philosopher either. I mean, early in his career, he was involved in all sorts of public stuff.
Yeah.
Notably, chairing the Committee on Obscenity and Censorship back in 1979. And get this, they actually used Mill's harm principle in their deliberations. Which, when you think about Williams' later work, it's kind of a hint of things to come. He wasn't just about theory. He wanted to see these ideas play out in the real world.
Yeah, totally. Even in that kind of practical context, right? You can already see his approach
Yeah.
using philosophical ideas, but in a way that's really attentive to, actual consequences, real world implications, not just dogmatically applying abstract rules.
Right. Okay, so then we get to the books. And his first book, Morality, An Introduction to Ethics, came out in 1972. And it's already clear what his major issues are going to be. Deep skepticism about these big moral theories, wariness of any claim to absolute truth in ethics, and this real hostility towards utilitarianism. And this quote from that book, I think, really captures his early position. There cannot be any very interesting, tidy, or self-contained theory of what morality is, nor can there be an ethical theory, which will yield a decision procedure for moral reasoning. I mean, that's pretty definitive.
Yeah, no kidding. It's like he's saying right off the bat, don't expect a neat algorithm for solving all your moral dilemmas. He really thought that the whole nature of ethical experience just resists that kind of systematization. It's just too messy, too complex.
Yeah, totally. And he was a prolific writer. So you've got Problems of the Self, Moral Luck, which, if you're interested in moral responsibility, you have to read that book. Then there's the super influential Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, Shame and Necessity, which is a really fascinating look at the ethical world of the Greeks.
Yeah.
And then later on, Truth and Truthfulness. Oh, and of course, his contribution to Utilitarianism, For and Against, where he wrote the Against section, which is just, a classic critique of
Oh,
utilitarianism.
yeah. And I think Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, that's probably his most systematic kind of laying out of his criticisms and, sketching what his alternative approach might look like. And that engagement with Greek ethics and shame and necessity, that's so interesting because he really brings out how different our modern morality system is from those earlier ways of thinking about ethics, where the focus was much more on character, on virtue. It's a real eye-opener.
Yeah, for sure. And a fun little biographical detail, just for anyone who's interested in the intersection of philosophy and politics. He actually moved to Berkeley in 1987 in protest of Thatcher's policies, and then later came back to Oxford in 1990 to take over as White's professor of moral philosophy, succeeding, guess who? Richard Hare. So his old tutor, the guy he had these big philosophical disagreements with, kind of a full circle moment.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. I mean, that really shows you like the impact he had even on people he really disagreed with. It's like they couldn't deny the power of his ideas, even if they didn't fully agree with him.
Yeah. Okay, and his last book, Truth and Truthfulness, that's a really interesting one, too. So he's arguing for the importance of truth and truthfulness, even in the face of all that postmodern skepticism that was going around at the time. And he even finds an unlikely ally in Nietzsche to try and give these values a kind of naturalistic grounding. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how exactly he does that, particularly his use of the idea of intrinsic value. But it just goes to show that he was still wrestling with these big philosophical questions right up to the end.
Yeah, for sure. So truth and truthfulness, he's taking on a whole different set of challenges, but that commitment to a naturalistic perspective, his suspicion of anything too abstract, too detached from human experience, those are still front and center.
Right. Okay. So that's the philosopher in a nutshell. Now let's really dive into his critique of moral philosophy as it was being done, back in the mid to late 20th century. So he had this really famous and kind of provocative claim early on. He said that moral philosophy had become peculiarly empty and boring. And the reason for this, and this is the kicker, is that it wasn't actually discussing moral issues at all. I mean, that's going to sting a little coming from a leading ethicist.
Oh, absolutely. That was a deliberate jab for sure. He wanted to shake things up, get people to pay attention to what he saw as this real disconnect between what moral philosophy was doing and what he thought it should be doing. So in his view, the field had become way too preoccupied with these kind of meta-ethical questions, like what do moral terms even mean? What's the logical structure of moral language? And in the process, he thought they were neglecting the actual lived experience of making moral decisions. Like, what do we actually do when we face a moral dilemma?
Yeah, exactly. And he did, to be fair, later on acknowledge the rise of applied ethics, which I guess you could say is closer to those moral issues he was talking about. But he still had this worry that, okay, even in applied ethics, what you often get is this kind of, surface level application of these big abstract theories to real world problems. And it's not really grappling with the human dimension, the messiness of it all. He had this great analogy. He compared it to, like, hospital auxiliary personnel who aren't actually doctors, which, I mean, you can really feel the concern there, right? Like, we need real expertise, real understanding, not just these theoretical frameworks.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It captures so well what he was getting at. It's like you can have all the right theories, all the right jargon, but if you don't have that deep, embodied understanding of what's actually going on, you're not really helping anyone.
Right. And at the heart of it all, I think, was this really fundamental belief that philosophy should speak to lived ethical experience. It shouldn't get so caught up in the beauty of a theory that it loses sight of the messiness, the particularity of life itself.
Yeah.
There's this echo of Hegel's critique of Kant in there, right? This worry about the emptiness of abstract moralizing. And it's a tension, I think, that continues to play out in ethical debates even today.
Oh, for sure. It's like, how do you balance those two things? The pull toward general principles and the need to stay grounded in the specifics of each situation, each person. It's an ongoing challenge.
Okay, so now let's get to one of his major targets, the peculiar institution, as he called it. And what he meant by that was this whole dominant morality system that he saw operating in moral philosophy. And he thought, this is really interesting, that this whole focus on these big abstract moral theories, that it was kind of an intellectual inheritance from logical positivism. You remember, logical positivism, they were very big on the idea that only statements that could be empirically verified were meaningful. And that led them to just dismiss all of ethics, all of normative ethics, as just basically meaningless expressions of emotion.
Right. So they were like, you can't test moral claims scientifically, so they're not real knowledge. And that kind of created this space where metaethics, the study of what moral terms even mean, that became the dominant approach in ethics. Because you could at least analyze the logic of moral language, even if you couldn't, prove or disprove any particular moral claim.
Right. Okay. So then along comes linguistic analysis. And you've got figures like Austin and really important here, R.M. Hare. And Hare's project, this is really interesting for anyone who's into the philosophy of language. He tried to derive the entire structure of morality from analyzing moral terms like ought and good. He called it universal prescriptivism. So the idea is when you make a moral judgment, you're basically issuing a universal prescription. You're saying that in all similar situations, everyone ought to act the same way.
Yeah, super ambitious project. It's like, okay, let's crack the code of moral language, and then we'll have the key to morality itself.
Right. But Williams and a lot of other philosophers, they weren't buying it. They thought this whole approach was just way too narrow, way too focused on just a few linguistic terms. And Williams had this great line. He said, if there is to be attention to language, then there should be attention to more of it. It's like he's saying, come on, guys, there's a whole rich vocabulary of moral terms we use, not just ought and good.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just about the number of terms either. It's about the way we actually use those terms, the way they function in our lives and our relationships. It's not just a matter of formal logic. It's about like the whole texture of our moral experience.
Okay, so that brings us to Williams's idea of morally thick concepts. And these are terms like coward, lie, brutality, gratitude. And his point is, these concepts, they're not just descriptive. They've got this built-in ethical evaluation. They're shaped by our culture, they guide our actions, and in a way they carry ethical knowledge with them. Like the very fact that we have a concept like brutality tells you something about how we see certain actions. That they're not just bad, they're morally reprehensible.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's not like with brutality, we're first describing something neutrally and then we're like, oh, and also that's bad. It's like the very concept of brutality already has that moral judgment baked in. It's like description and evaluation, they're all tangled up together.
Yeah. And here's a really interesting point he makes that I think is particularly relevant for us as philosophers, thinking about the foundations of morality. He argued that the kind of authority we give to terms like ought, right, and good, that this only really makes sense within a certain kind of worldview, like a Christian worldview. Because there you have this background of divine law, divine command. But once you lose that, it's like what Nietzsche said about morality after the death of God, or like Anscombe's famous analogy. It's like having the concept of criminal, but no criminal law.
Yeah.
Like the whole context that gave those concepts meaning is gone, but we're still using the language.
Right. Like it's almost like we're playing this moral language game, but we've forgotten the rules.
Exactly. Okay, so Williams, he really went after this whole morality system. And he actually summarized its key features in like 9 theses. And we won't go through all of them, but just to give you a taste, some of the key ones are like morality is fundamentally practical. So ought implies can't, right. You can only be obligated to do what you're actually capable of doing. And then there's the idea that moral obligations can't really conflict. And then this pressure towards generalization, like every specific obligation has to be based on some universalizable principle. And the idea that moral obligation is just inescapable and always trumps every other consideration. That only an obligation can outweigh another obligation.
Right. So it's like this very rigid hierarchy. Morality's at the top and everything else has to get in line.
Right. And then you've got the purity of morality, the denial of moral luck, the idea that blame is the central moral reaction, and it's always directed at the voluntary. And then this big one, impersonality. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of the morality system, as Williams saw it.
Right. And I think the important thing to remember is, for him, all these features are kind of connected. They all fit together into this overall picture of ethics that he thought was just way too simplistic and ultimately, distorting our understanding of how we actually live our moral lives.
Okay, so let's dig into some of his specific objections. And I think a couple of these will really resonate, for people coming from a philosophical background. So take those first two, practicality and the absence of genuine conflict. Williams, he just flat out rejected the idea that moral obligations can never really conflict. He said, look, in real life, we face genuine dilemmas all the time, and sometimes there's just no way to resolve them without doing something wrong, without making a choice that has real moral costs. And he called this ineliminable agent regret, that sense that you've done something wrong, even if you did the best you could in a bad situation.
Right. It's like even if you pick the least bad option, you still have to live with the consequences. And it's not irrational to feel regret, even if you know you couldn't have done anything else.
Yeah. And he has this really vivid example of a shipwreck officer who has to decide, do I push some of the survivors back into the water to keep the lifeboat from capsizing, or do we all go down together? And, I mean, talk about a terrible choice, right? But even if he saves more lives by pushing some people back in, he's still going to feel this deep regret for the ones he sacrificed. And for Williams, that regret, that's not a sign that he made the wrong decision. It's a sign that he's a moral agent who understands the weight of his choice.
Right. And the morality system, with its emphasis on, finding the right answer, the right rule to apply, it doesn't really have space for that kind of regret. It's like once you've done your moral calculus and figured out the right thing to do, any lingering guilt or regret is just like irrational.
Yeah, totally. It's trying to present this picture of ethics where there's always a clean solution, where you can kind of wash your hands of the moral messiness once you found the right principle to apply.
Yeah.
But Williams is like, no, that's not how it works in the real world.
And that leads straight into his critique of the obligation out, obligation in principle, right? This idea that for every specific moral choice you make, there has to be some general universalizable principle backing it up. Williams thought that just led to all sorts of crazy demands and what he called one thought too many.
Yeah, that one thought too many idea is so brilliant. He uses this example of, rescuing your wife from a burning building. And he says, look, if your first thought is, well, there's a general obligation to save lives, and I guess it's okay to prioritize my wife in this case, you've already had one thought too many. Like, the reason you save your wife isn't because of some abstract principle, it's because she's your wife. It's this deeply personal, intimate relationship. And demanding that every action be justified by some general rule, it actually misses the point. It obscures what's really ethically relevant.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to the heart of his concern about the way this morality system can kind of alienate us from our own deepest commitments, our own sense of what matters. It's like it wants us to constantly be justifying our actions to this impersonal moral court rather than just acknowledging the value of our relationships, our commitments for what they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this also ties into his point about the supposed inescapability of morality. Williams argued that, okay, moral considerations are important, no doubt, but they're not the only important considerations in a human life. We've also got our personal projects, our relationships, our pursuit of meaning. And he thought that moral obligation, it actually gets its force from this broader sphere of importance. So it can't be like absolutely inescapable, always trumping everything else.
Right. Morality is not just this external force that's always pushing us around. It's rooted in what matters to us and how we make sense of our lives.
And the Gauguin example, this is the one he's really famous for. So the artist, right, abandons his family to go pursue his art. And for Williams, this is a really stark example of someone choosing something else, something that's deeply important to them, over their moral obligations. And he's not necessarily condoning it, but he's saying, look, this happens, people do this. And maybe there's even something valuable in the fact that not everyone is always just marching to the beat of moral obligation.
It's like it keeps things interesting, right? It introduces a bit of unpredictability into human affairs.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then there's the big one, moral luck. So the morality system, it really wants to focus on what's in our control, what we do voluntarily. But as Williams points out, our moral judgments in real life, they're all tangled up with things that are outside our control, with luck. We judge the attempted murderer differently from the successful one, even if they had the exact same intentions. And the reckless driver who happens to hit someone, we judge them more harshly than the one who gets lucky and doesn't hit anyone.
Right. It's like our intuition is that the outcome matters morally,
Yeah.
even if it wasn't entirely within the person's control.
Yeah. And Williams argues that this isn't just some irrational bias we have. It's actually pointing to something deep about our moral experience. He introduces this idea of, first, constitutive luck, which is like the kind of person you are, which is obviously shaped by all sorts of factors outside your control. And then there's resultant luck, which is how your actions actually turn out, which again is not always entirely up to you. And he even talks about how certain events can leave a kind of miasma on a person morally speaking, even if they weren't fully responsible for what happened. It's like in the story of Oedipus, right? He didn't know he was going to kill his father and marry his mother,
Yeah.
but the very fact that he did, that casts a shadow over him morally that's hard to shake off.
Yeah. It's like there are certain actions that even if you didn't intend them, they kind of stain you, they change who you are in a way that just doing something good later on can't fully erase.
Yeah. And all of this, it really challenges that central focus on blame that's so important in the morality system.
Mhm.
Williams is like, look, our moral lives are so much richer, so much more complex than just blame.
Right.
We've got regret, we've got shame, all these other moral emotions that the morality system just kind of flattens out. And that's why he thinks we need a more nuanced, a more psychologically realistic picture of ethics.
So it's not that he's saying blame is never appropriate. It's more like he's pushing us to see that it's not the whole story. It's not the only tool in the ethical toolbox.
Right. Okay, so now that we've kind of laid out Williams's critique of this general morality system, let's turn to one of its most prominent examples, utilitarianism. And Williams had, some very strong opinions about utilitarianism. He even said at one point, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that he hoped the discussion of it would move to more rewarding contexts. Like, can we please just move on? Which, coming from a major figure in ethics, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, he was not a fan. But it's not just like a personal dislike, right? There are real philosophical reasons for his opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. So one reason, I think, is that he just generally disliked isms. And by that, he meant these big systematic theories that try to reduce all of ethics to a single principle. And he thought, anytime you try to do that, you're going to lose something. You're going to end up oversimplifying things, ignoring important ethical ideas. And he made this really great point. He said that a lot of these theories, they assume we have too many ethical ideas. He's like, no, we actually have too few. We need to cherry the ones we have.
Yeah. And I think he was especially worried about like the way these systematic theories can shut down certain kinds of moral thinking. It's like if you're always looking at things through the lens of, say, maximizing utility, you might miss other ways of seeing the situation, other moral considerations that are just as important.
Right. And then think about this as a normative theory, right? Utilitarianism is telling us how we ought to act, what we should value. But then it's like, wait a minute, by what right does it get to do that?
Yeah.
Who gave it the authority to dictate our moral sentiments?
Yeah, good point. It's like, is there some like higher moral court that's handed down this utilitarian code and we're all just supposed to obey it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he also thought that utilitarianism was just a really clear example of the morality system in action. So all those problems we were talking about, the denial of moral conflict, the one thought too many phenomenon, they're all there in utilitarianism. But I think the one he really focused on was its impersonality. Remember that ninth thesis?
Right, the impersonality. And he makes this really interesting comparison to Kant. So Kant, he says, abstracts away from like our personal desires, our inclinations in favor of these universal rational principles. But utilitarianism, he thinks it goes even further. It actually abstracts away from the separateness of persons. It's just focused on maximizing total happiness or utility, and it doesn't really matter who's experiencing that happiness or who's suffering. Individuals are just like these vessels for happiness and suffering, and they don't really have any intrinsic significance as individuals. It's a pretty stark view.
Yeah, it is. And that leads to this, kind of infamous doctrine of negative responsibility in utilitarianism, right?
Yeah.
So not only are you responsible for the consequences of your own actions, but you're also responsible for the consequences you could have prevented, even if you didn't actually cause them. Which, for Williams, that just completely blurs the line between doing something and allowing something to happen.
Right. It's like you're always on the hook morally for anything bad that happens that you could have potentially stopped. Which, I mean, talk about a recipe for anxiety, right?
Yeah, for sure. And this brings us to the big one, the integrity objection. So Williams' point is moral agency, it's always someone's agency. You can't just have this impartial, detached agent the way utilitarianism seems to want. When we make decisions, we make them from our values, our commitments, our projects. We're not just these neutral instruments of some big utility maximizing machine. And he argues that, utilitarianism could actually require us to abandon our most deeply held commitments, our projects, even our relationships, if doing so would maximize overall happiness. And he famously said that it's absurd to demand that someone just step aside from what gives their life meaning and endorse some action just because it happens to produce the best overall outcome. That's what he means by alienating us from our own agency, from our integrity.
Right. And he's not saying, like, integrity is always the most important thing and you should never compromise it. It's more like he's saying that utilitarianism doesn't even have a way to understand what integrity is because it's got this fundamentally distorted view of what it means to be a moral agent.
Yeah. And this connects to another really important point. So Williams, he's not just making this counterexample argument, right? He's not
Mm.
just saying, oh, here's a case where utilitarianism gets the wrong answer.
Hmm.
He even says in those famous examples of Jim and George where they have to make these really tough choices, he says, maybe the utilitarian answer is actually the right one in terms of what they should do. But the problem is how utilitarianism gets to that answer. It's the reasoning process, the way it just completely ignores the personal cost, the psychological cost of making those kinds of choices.
Yeah. It's like it's trying to force everyone into this one-size-fits-all moral mold, and it doesn't leave any room for individual differences for the things that make each person's moral experience unique.
And this brings up another key term for Williams, these ground projects. So these are like those long-term commitments and values that give our lives meaning and direction. And he thought that utilitarianism, with its focus on just maximizing overall happiness, it just can't really account for the importance of those projects. He famously said, the reason why utilitarianism cannot understand integrity is that it cannot coherently describe the relations between a man's projects and his actions. So there's this fundamental incompatibility between what utilitarianism is trying to do and how we actually live our lives as moral agents.
And it's not just that it can't describe those relations, it's almost like it wants to sever them, right? It's like, look, just do whatever maximizes utility and don't worry about how it affects your personal projects, your relationships, your sense of self.
Yeah, and he was especially critical of Sidgwick's idea of the point of view of the universe as the ideal standpoint for ethical thinking. So this is the idea that you have to step outside your own perspective, your own values, and try to see things from this totally impartial cosmic perspective. And Williams is like, first of all, that's just impossible. You can't actually step outside your own skin like that. And second of all, even if you could, it would be undesirable. Our ethical lives, they're rooted in our particular perspective, our particular values, our particular relationships. To try to detach from all of that, it would be like trying to detach from ourselves.
Right. It's like trying to become this abstract moral calculator rather than a real living, breathing person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he even thought that indirect utilitarianism, which is this idea that, okay, maybe we shouldn't always act like utilitarians in our daily lives, but we should follow these rules that will generally lead to the best outcomes in the long run. He even thought that was kind of incoherent. He famously said that it would be best if no one were actually a utilitarian, which, I mean, that's a pretty damning assessment of a moral theory.
Yeah. Like, this theory is so good, it's best if no one actually uses it.
Right. Now, some people might push back and say, wait a minute, there's a perfectly reasonable common sense notion of impartiality that doesn't require us to, like, adopt this crazy point of view of the universe.
Yeah.
And I think Williams would say, yeah, sure, there's a kind of impartiality that's important, like fairness, treating like cases alike.
Right.
But he would argue that that kind of impartiality, it's just one ethical consideration among many. It's not this foundational principle that everything else has to be derived from.
Right. It's a tool we can use, but it's not the whole toolbox.
Yeah. So for Williams, it's that insistence on this absolute impersonal impartiality. That's really the problem with utilitarianism. Okay, so that brings us finally to internal and external reasons. And this is where Williams really made his mark on, action theory and ethics.
Yeah, his internal reasons thesis, this is a big one.
Yeah. So the basic idea, and this is going to sound a little jargony, but we'll try to unpack it, is that all genuine reasons for action, they have to be internal to the agent, to the person who's acting. So in other words, for you to have a reason to do something, there has to be some connection to your existing desires, your values, your motivations. That's what he means by internal reasons. And then he contrasts that with external reasons, which would be reasons that somehow apply to you, even if you don't have any corresponding motivation.
Mm.
And Williams is firmly in the internal reasons camp. He thinks the whole idea of external reasons just doesn't make sense.
Right. It's like, how could something be a reason for you to act if it has nothing to do with anything you care about?
Yeah. And he's very clear that this is a necessary condition for having a reason, not a sufficient condition. So just because you desire something doesn't automatically mean you have a good reason to pursue it. But you can't have a genuine reason without some connection to your existing motivations or to what you could come to be motivated by through, rational deliberation.
Right. It's like the desires are the fuel and reason is the engine. You need both to get anywhere.
And one of his main arguments for the internal reasons thesis is this idea about explanation. He says, look, When we talk about reasons for action, we're trying to explain why someone did what they did. And if an alleged external reason has absolutely no connection to the person's motivations,